October 14th, 2021 began as a morning of atmospheric clarity in the high alpine reaches of the Alpine Lakes Wilderness. It was on this Tuesday that a seasonal trail maintenance worker clearing a secondary drainage pipe near a dormant creek bed reached into the silt and pulled out a standard hiking boot. It was a rugged, high-end model, weathered by 4 winters of snowmelt and sun, but structurally intact. The worker expected the boot to be empty, a relic of litter. Instead, nestled deep within the toe box, wrapped in a precision-cut square of waterproof polyethylene, was a 64-gigabyte SD card. This was an object that should not have survived the elements, yet it sat there, preserved with a deliberate, almost surgical intent. This discovery would reopen a void that had remained hollow since late 2016. To understand the gravity of this plastic sliver, we must return to the beginning of the void. On September 12, 2016, Elena Vance prepared for what she called a sovereign trek. Elena was not an amateur. She was a professional surveyor with over 1,500 logged solo hours in Class 4 terrain. She carried a satellite messenger, a redundant GPS unit, and a topographical map she had annotated herself with geological notations. Her preparedness was her identity. She was the person others called when the terrain became illegible. At 5:45 a.m., she parked her vehicle at the trailhead. The weather forecast was stable. The barometric pressure was holding. There was no reason to suspect that the mountain would become a site of erasure. By 9 a.m., she had reached the first ridgeline. We know this because her satellite messenger sent a routine all-clear ping to her emergency contact. The metadata from that ping placed her exactly on the intended path. She was moving at a consistent pace of 2.8 miles per hour. The terrain was steep, but for Elena it was a familiar staircase of granite and shale. At 11:30 a.m., a second ping was recorded. She was near the summit of Osgard Pass. The message read, "Light fog rolling in, adjusting descent to West Ridge for better visibility." This was the last digital heartbeat Elena Vance would ever emit. When she failed to check in at 6 p.m., the machinery of search and rescue began to turn. It was a massive mobilization. Thermal imaging drones swept the scree slopes. Ground teams with cadaver dogs traversed every known trail and dozens of social paths created by wildlife. They found nothing. No discarded wrappers, no scuff marks on the lichen-covered rocks, no signal, no trace, just silence. The mountains keep their secrets, and for 5 years Elena Vance was one of them. The initial investigation focused on the geological trap theory. It was assumed she had fallen into a hidden crevice or been buried by a localized rock slide. But the searchers, the grieving investigators who returned every summer on their own time, couldn't reconcile the disappearance with Elena's expertise. She knew the West Ridge. She knew the dangers of the fog. Why would she vanish on a section of trail she had mapped for the state? The discovery of the boot in 2021 changed the geometry of the tragedy. It wasn't found on the West Ridge. It was found 4 miles away in a drainage basin that required crossing 2 separate glacial streams, areas Elena had no reason to visit. The memory card inside the boot was immediately sent to a forensic data recovery lab. The card had suffered minor bit rot from the cold, but the internal housing had remained sealed. When the technicians finally bridged the connection, they found 44 high-resolution images and 3 video files. The timestamps began at 12:15 p.m. on the day of her disappearance. The first image is a standard summit photo. Elena is smiling, her gear perfectly adjusted. But in the background, the fog she mentioned is no longer light. It is a dense, opaque wall of white. It looks less like weather and more like a physical barrier. At 12:40 p.m., the photos change. They are no longer of landscapes. They are macro shots of the ground. The focus is sharp, obsessive. She is photographing specific patterns in the frost. There is a sense of forensic documentation in her own photography. At 1:12 p.m., the first video begins. The audio is mostly wind, but beneath it you can hear Elena's voice. It is calm, but the rhythm of her breathing is elevated. She says, "The compass is deviating 40 degrees to the east. The GPS has lost lock." I am following the drainage as a failsafe. Imagine you are standing on that summit. You are a professional. You have the tools. You have the training. And yet the physics of the world around you begin to fray. The very instruments that defined your safety have become liars. You look at the sun, but the light is diffused, coming from nowhere and everywhere. You begin to walk. You are confident. But at 2:30 p.m., Elena captures an image of a landmark she should have passed 2 hours prior, a twisted cedar tree with a distinct lightning scar. She had walked in a perfect circle, despite her belief that she was moving in a straight line toward the valley. This is the moment the expert realizes the mountain is no longer a landscape to be traversed, but a labyrinth to be survived. At 3:15 p.m., the photos stop being analytical. They become frantic. There are shots of the sky, blurred and overexposed. There are shots of her own boots, as if she is checking to see if she is still grounded. The irony of her preparedness is painful to observe in the metadata. She had enough food for 3 days, she had a bivy sack, she had a stove. But preparedness assumes a predictable environment. It assumes that if you walk south, you will arrive south. The mountains don't explain why the rules of navigation sometimes dissolve. At 4:45 p.m., the light begins to fail. The penultimate photo is a shot of her open backpack. The items are laid out with obsessive neatness. One headlamp, 2 spare lithium batteries, a first aid kit, a compass that appears to be spinning, and a small journal. This evidence log captured in a digital amber shows a woman trying to maintain order in the face of an impossible reality. The final video file is dated 6:02 p.m. The screen is black. For 3 minutes, there is only the sound of rhythmic tapping, metal against stone. It is a signal, SOS, but there is no one to hear it. The darkness of the wilderness in September is absolute. When the sun goes down, the temperature drops 40 degrees in an hour. Elena was dressed for movement, not for a static night in a thermal sink. The question that haunts the investigators who look at these files years later is not where she went, but why she felt the need to hide the memory card in her shoe. Why would a woman who knew she was dying take the time to wrap a digital card in plastic and wedge it into her footwear, only for it to be found miles from her last known location? Why would she do this? The mountains keep their secrets, but Elena Vance was determined to leave a record of the silence. She was an expert victim, and even in her final hours, she was a chronicler of her own tragedy. She was mapping a territory that wasn't supposed to exist. The investigator looks at the last timestamp. 6:05 p.m., the end of the digital record, the beginning of the 5-year void. We look at the weathered boot, the rusted eyelets, the moss growing on the leather, and we see the remains of a struggle that was both physical and existential. The search for Elena Vance was never just about finding a body. It was about finding a reason. But the reason is often the first thing to be lost in the high country. As we move from the void of the disappearance into the cold reality of the physical evidence, we are forced to confront the limit of human agency. We are forced to ask if some places on this earth are not meant to be mapped. The evidence is a bridge, but it leads to a shore that is clouded in the same fog that took Elena. There is a justice in memory, a way of honoring the lost by obsessing over the details they left behind. We owe it to the expert who failed to look at the evidence with the same clinical precision she used to record it. We owe it to the silence to listen to the tapping on that final video. We must understand that the mountain is indifferent to our maps. The mountain does not care about our GPS coordinates. The mountain only knows the weight of the snow and the passage of time. And so we continue to look at the photos. We look at the way the light hits the granite in that final hour. We look for the ghost in the metadata. We look for Elena Vance in the 64 gigabytes of a memory card that shouldn't have survived. Is it possible to be so prepared that you notice the impossible before it consumes you? Is it possible that Elena wasn't lost but was instead a witness to something the rest of us aren't supposed to see? The investigation moves forward, but the trail is cold. The trail is made of stone and shadow. The trail ends in a shoe, in a creek, 5 years too late. The forensic analysis of the memory card's physical placement reveals a chilling level of intentionality. Elena Vance did not simply lose her boot. The recovery team, led by a former colleague who had spent years obsessing over the Vance Gap, noted that the polyethylene wrapping around the SD card was not a standard piece of trash. It was a section of her own topographic map, cut with a blade. She had sacrificed her primary navigation tool to protect the data. This act of preservation suggests that by 6 p.m., Elena was no longer trying to find her way out. She was trying to ensure the story of her presence remained. The discovery phase of the investigation began in earnest when the boot was brought into the precinct. This wasn't just a recovery mission anymore. It was a forensic autopsy of a vanished life. Specialists examined the wear patterns on the sole. The Vibram rubber showed significant rounding on the inner edges, a sign of high mileage trekking through abrasive scree. But there was something else, trace amounts of a mineral not native to the Osgard Pass region. It was a rare form of volcanic obsidian, typically found 30 miles to the north. How did Elena or her footwear travel 30 miles through some of the most treacherous terrain in North America in the space of a few hours? The grieving investigator proxy, in this case a digital forensic expert named Sarah Miller, began to peel back the layers of the file system on the card. Sarah noticed a series of hidden files, ghost fragments of data that hadn't been fully overwritten. These were XCF headers without images, metadata shadows of photos that had been deleted. The timestamps on these deleted files were clustered between 5 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. This creates a terrifying timeline. Elena was taking photos, then systematically deleting them. Why would a surveyor trained to value every data point erase her own record while she was in distress? Was she trying to save space on the card, or was she trying to unsee something she had captured? At 5:15 p.m., the metadata suggests a burst mode was activated, 24 frames per second. This is usually reserved for capturing fast-moving wildlife or a fall in progress. But there are no images, just the record of the shutter firing. The physical evidence extends beyond the boot. Following the discovery of the SD card, a specialized grid search was initiated around the drainage pipe. 6 days into the search, a second item was recovered, a titanium tent stake. It was driven into the frozen earth at a 45-degree angle, 3 miles from the boot. There was no tent, there was no campsite, just a single solitary stake driven into the ground with enough force to bend the metal. This is the impossible discovery that defies the logic of survival. An expert like Elena wouldn't waste calories driving a stake into the ground without a purpose. It was a marker, a desperate attempt to anchor herself to a world that was becoming increasingly fluid. The investigator asks, what was she anchoring herself against? The mountains don't explain why a woman would leave her boot in a creek and her map in her shoe. They keep their secrets in the rust and the moss. Sarah Miller's analysis moved into the GPS drift phase. She mapped the coordinates embedded in the photo metadata against the official satellite logs from that day. The results were a cartographic nightmare. According to the photos, Elena was moving at speeds that exceeded human capability. Between two photos taken 3 minutes apart, the metadata showed a distance of 1.2 miles. To cover that ground, she would have had to be moving at 24 miles per hour across a vertical rock face. This is forensic dissonance, where the data provided by the machines contradicts the reality of the human body. Imagine you are Sarah, sitting in a climate-controlled office looking at these numbers. You see the logic of physics breaking down on your screen. You see the expert victim being propelled through a landscape that is no longer behaving according to the laws of Euclidean geometry. You begin to feel the melancholic weight of the tragedy. It wasn't a lack of preparation that killed Elena, but a lack of a reality she could rely on. At 5:40 p.m., the metadata shows the altitude sensor on her device spiked. It registered an elevation of 14,000 feet. The highest peak in the region is only 9,500 feet. Elena Vance was, according to her own equipment, 3,000 feet in the air. This thermal imaging of a digital breakdown provides a window into the horror of her final hour. Was it a hardware failure caused by atmospheric electricity, or was the mountain itself distorting the signals? We look at the macro shots of the dirt and the lichen found on the boot. Forensic botanists identified a species of moss that only grows in deep subterranean environments, caves or fissures where sunlight never reaches. Yet the boot was found in an open drainage pipe. The evidence log continues to grow, and with each item the mystery deepens. A single strand of high-tensile paracord was found snagged on a branch near the tent stake. It had been cut, not frayed. The cut was clean, made by a sharp blade. Elena's multi-tool was never found. We are left with the image of a woman cutting herself loose from something, from her gear, from her path, from herself. The rule of irony is at its most cruel here. The very tools meant to save her, the cord, the stake, the map, were being discarded or destroyed. The mountains keep their secrets, and the secrets are written in the language of discarded objects. The reconstruction of her narrative truth begins to take a darker turn as Sarah Miller discovers a single audio memo buried in the card's root directory. It is only 8 seconds long. It was recorded at 5:58 p.m. In the recording, there is no wind. The silence is heavy, artificial. Then the sound of a zipper, and Elena's voice, a mere whisper. It's not the fog, it's the light. It's following the light. Why would she say this? In the deep wilderness, light is safety. Light is the sun, the headlamp, the rescue flare. To fear the light is to have your entire survival instinct inverted. The grieving investigator obsesses over these 8 seconds, playing them back, filtering the static, looking for a heartbeat in the background. But there is only the silence of the alpine night. The reconstruction phase forces us to look at the open loop of her final moments. If the GPS was drifting, if the altitude was spiking, and if she was terrified of the light, where did she go? The physical evidence, the boot, the card, the stake, acts as a breadcrumb trail that leads into a wall. We are standing on the edge of the void, looking at the technical terms like metadata and GPS drift, trying to use them as a shield against the haunting reality. The truth is that Elena Vance, the expert, the surveyor, the woman who knew the terrain better than anyone, was erased by a force that doesn't leave footprints. She left the card for us to find, a message in a bottle cast into a sea of stone. But the message is a warning. It is a moral warning about the arrogance of our maps. We believe that because we have named the peaks and measured the depths, we own the wilderness. But the mountains don't care about our names. They are indifferent to our justice. As we move into the final reconstruction of her narrative, we must accept that some trails don't lead home. They lead into the narrative truth of the mountain, a truth that is somber, analytical, and entirely reverent of the dark. The reconstruction of Elena Vance's final trajectory requires us to look past the physical landscape and into the narrative truth of a fractured reality. By 6:15 p.m. on that September evening, the chronological record suggests she had entered a state of functional dissociation, a psychological phenomenon where an expert, realizing their environment has become non-Euclidean, stops trying to navigate and begins to document. We see this in the forensic image recovered from the SD card's temporary cache. It is a photo of her own hand holding her compass. The needle is not pointing north. It is pointing directly upward toward the zenith of the sky. No signal, no trace, just the impossible. The grieving investigator, Sarah Miller, cross-referenced the atmospheric data from the nearest weather station at Kolchak Lake. At 6:20 p.m., the station recorded a localized ionization event, a sudden, unexplained surge in static electricity that lasted for 90 seconds. In the reconstruction, this is the moment the light Elena whispered about likely manifested. Imagine you are standing on that subalpine ridge. The air begins to hum with the frequency of a downed power line. The hair on your arm stands up. The fog, once white and blinding, begins to luminescence with a pale, sickly violet hue. You are an expert. You know this shouldn't happen. You know that the GPS drift you're experiencing is now a symptom of a larger atmospheric collapse. At 6:22 p.m., a final uncatalogued file was recovered using deep sector scanning. It wasn't a photo or a video, but a log file from her satellite messenger's internal diagnostic. It shows the device attempting to send an outgoing message to a coordinate that does not exist on any terrestrial map. The latitude and longitude fields are filled with null values, yet the device registered a handshake successful status. She wasn't calling for help. The device was communicating with something else. The evidence log now includes the psychological artifacts left behind. In her annotated map, the one she used to wrap the SD card, Elena had circled a specific area of the enchantment peaks 3 times. When investigators visited this site in late 2021, they found a lithic circle, a ring of stones, each weighing approximately 40 pounds, arranged with mathematical precision. These stones were not moved by wind or water, they were placed. Beneath the central stone was a single item, Elena's wedding ring tucked into a crevice. The rule of irony dictates that the more she prepared to be found, the more she ensured she would be forgotten by the world she knew. Why would she leave her ring under 40 pounds of granite? Why would an expert surveyor create a monument in a place she was supposed to be fleeing? The mountains don't explain why, and the expert victim doesn't leave a manual for their own erasure. Forensic storytelling often relies on the thermal signature of a life, the heat left behind in the wake of a person. But Elena's trail was cold. The reconstruction suggests that after 6:30 p.m., she began a vertical descent, not down the mountain but into a fissure. The moss found on her boot, that subterranean species, suggests she spent hours, perhaps days, in a space beneath the crust of the earth. The metadata on the SD card shows a final system shutdown due to extreme temperature variance. The card went from 40 degrees Fahrenheit to negative 100 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 4 seconds. This is not weather. This is a laboratory condition. This is the open loop that refuses to close. Sarah Miller, obsessed with the metadata shadow, found that the boot recovered in the drainage pipe hadn't been washed there by a flood. The sediment inside the boot was dry. It had been placed in the pipe, shielded from the water, by someone who understood exactly how a search team would eventually clear those drains. It was a time capsule. The forensic casual explanation is that Elena Vance survived her initial disappearance, lived for an unknown period in a state of hyper-analytical observation, and eventually chose a method of delivery for her final evidence. She used her own footwear as a vessel, knowing that the mundane action of a maintenance worker would one day bring her story back to the light. But what of the woman herself? At 7 p.m. in the reconstruction, the mountain is silent. The static-filled archival footage of our mind sees a woman standing in the dark, without her boots, without her ring, watching a light that shouldn't exist. She is no longer a victim, she has become a chronicler of the void. The grieving investigator concludes that Elena didn't die of exposure or a fall. She died of a narrative breach, a moment where her understanding of the world could no longer contain the reality she was witnessing. The mountains keep their secrets, but they allow us these small plastic fragments to remind us of our own fragility. We look at the macro shots of the rust on the tent stake and we see the passage of 5 years, but for Elena, in that final video, time had already stopped. The impossible discovery isn't the card, it's the fact that she wanted us to see what happened to her instruments. She wanted us to know that the compass failed. She wanted us to know that the map was sacrificed. She wanted us to know that the expert is never truly prepared for the mountain that doesn't want to be known. Why would she do this? To provide justice through memory, to ensure that even if her body was never recovered, her witness would be. We are left with the rhetorical echo of her tapping on the stone, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The universal cry for help, rendered in the dark by a woman who had already accepted that no help was coming. The final reconstruction of the Elena Vance case leads us to a moral warning, a chilling conclusion that transcends the technical jargon of GPS drift and forensic imaging. By the time the clock reached 8:14 p.m. on that final night in 2016, the data indicates that Elena had ceased all movement. The metadata on the final image, a corrupted pitch-black frame, contains a latitude and longitude that, when plotted, exists 300 feet below the solid granite surface of the enchantment peaks. There are no known caves there. There are no fissures large enough for a human, no signal, no trace, just the cold weight of the earth. The grieving investigator, Sarah Miller, spent the final months of the inquiry looking not at the mountain, but at the expert victim herself. She found that Elena had been researching magnetic anomalies and atmospheric displacement in the weeks leading up to her trek. This wasn't a random disappearance, it was a confrontation. Elena Vance, with her redundant systems and her professional grit, was attempting to measure the unmeasurable. The rule of irony reaches its zenith here. The very curiosity that made her a master of her craft was the lure that drew her into the void. At 9:45 p.m., the record of Elena Vance's life ends. The reconstruction suggests a final act of forensic sacrifice. She removed her boot, not because she was delirious, but because it was the only way to leave the memory card in a place where the mountain's erratic ionization events wouldn't erase the data. She placed the boot in the drainage basin miles from her location, an impossible distance that suggests the landscape itself was folding, bringing two distant points together for a brief, terrifying moment. The slow pan over weathered objects in the evidence locker, the bent tent stake, the single boot, the square of a map, tells the story of a woman who tried to use logic to fight a ghost. Imagine you are standing on that summit now, years later. You look at your own phone, your own GPS, and you feel a tremor of doubt. You realize that your safety is a thin veil, a consensus reality that the mountains do not share. The open-loop question remains, where is the rest of Elena? If the boot and the card were found, where is the woman who wore them? The mountains don't explain why, and they don't give back what they have truly taken. They keep their secrets in the deep strata of the earth, in the static-filled archival footage of our own nightmares. Sarah Miller eventually resigned from the forensic lab. She claimed she could still hear the rhythmic tapping from the final video file even when the speakers were off. This is the haunting legacy of the Vance case, the way the evidence infects the observer. We obsess over the granular details, the timestamps, and the macro shots of rust, because if we can explain the how, we don't have to face the what. We don't have to acknowledge that an expert, a person just like us but better prepared, can be erased in an instant by a light that follows. The final moral warning is this: do not mistake your tools for your mastery. Do not believe that because you have a map you cannot be lost. Elena Vance had the best maps money could buy, and she ended her life as a whisper in a shoe. The impossible discovery of the SD card was not a gift of closure, it was a reminder of our own insignificance. The mountains are not a backdrop for our adventures. They are a sovereign territory with their own physics and their own hunger. As the screen fades to black, we are left with a flashbulb transition of that final photo, the compass needle pointing straight up. It is a silent command to look away from the horizon and toward the unknown. The reconstruction is complete, the narrative truth has been revealed, and yet the void remains. The mountains keep their secrets. They always have. They always will. Justice through memory is the only justice Elena Vance will ever receive. We honor her by acknowledging that she saw the truth, even as it consumed her. We honor her by being afraid. No signal, no trace. Just the mountain, standing silent in the fog, waiting for the next expert to arrive.